Hello, and welcome to Philosophy 103, Introduction to Logic. I'm Dr. Barry Vaughn, and I'll be your guide in the following video series. This is Lecture 1, an absurdly brief overview of academic philosophy. In this video, we'll survey the 5 major subdisciplines of philosophy, as well as attempt to answer the basic question, what is philosophy? So let's get started. One of the best ways to begin the study of a new discipline is to have a firm definition of the subject matter in mind. After all, if we have a clear conception of what we're talking about, it will be easier to talk about it. But philosophy is one of those academic disciplines that everybody thinks they know about, but in reality don't. So let's go back to the very beginning and think about when, where, and why the word philosophy even entered the vocabulary. Etymology is the study of words, their origin, their history, and how they've changed over time. So thinking about philosophy, just the word, from an etymological point of view is going to be a really great place to start. The word philosophy is actually a mashup of 2 ancient Greek terms, philia and sophia. Philia meaning love, and sophia meaning wisdom. So literally, the word philosophy means the love of wisdom. It seems to have been coined sometime around the 5th century BCE. Pythagoras is purported to have called himself a philosophos, or lover of wisdom, as opposed to a sophos, or wise man or sage, which would have been the more traditional term. But it's really in the hands of Aristocles, or Plato as we know him today, that philosophos and philosopheo entered the mainstream vocabulary of the ancient Greeks. Now, Plato's published works, written in the form of dialogues over the course of his adult life, use the character of his mentor Socrates to explore questions that form the foundation of the Western tradition of philosophy. What is the nature of virtue? What does it mean to have knowledge? Why is the universe the way it is? What is a just society, and can it be achieved? What happens when we die? These and a myriad other questions are explored by Plato in his dialogues, and since the founding of his school of philosophy in Athens, called the Academy, lovers of wisdom have been striving to answer these questions. Therein lies the first key to understanding what philosophy actually is. It's the pursuit of wisdom, not the possession of it. Philosophy is an activity. It's an infatuation. It's a struggle to be in the presence of Sophia. It is not the possession of wisdom. According to Plato, the greatest paradigm of a philosophos, Socrates, never achieved his goal, and indeed, upon his condemnation by the citizens of Athens in 399, said that he would continue his pursuit in the afterlife, if it turned out that there was one. This is what we learn from the etymological definition of philosophy. Philosophers are not wise. They are people who seek to be wise. And that, of course, requires us to recognize that we don't have wisdom in the first place. And what, of course, is wisdom? That also is a really interesting question. Unfortunately, we don't have time to give an analysis of it here. What we can say is that wisdom is at least a kind of knowledge or an understanding of the truth. And then, of course, you ask, what is the truth? Well, again, for our present purposes, we can only say that it is however the world turns out to be. The truth is whatever is the case. While understanding the original context and usage of the word philosophy is very enlightening, there are other ways of approaching the definition of philosophy that will also be useful. When we think about philosophy today, we primarily think about the academy, the social institution which has been created to discover, transmit, and preserve our knowledge of the world. In that context, we can think of philosophy being analogous to science. Science is not one thing, it's not one discipline. It's not one field of study, but rather a whole set of related areas of research. Academically speaking, science is an umbrella term for a set of distinct but related subjects of inquiry. And philosophy is very much the same kind of thing. Under the academic umbrella, philosophy contains 5 distinct sub-disciplines, each of which has its own area of inquiry, but all of which are related through a common methodology. We have epistemology, we have metaphysics, we have axiology, we have logic, and we have the history of philosophy. So let's just take a few minutes and talk a little bit about these 5 major sub-disciplines which compose academic philosophy today. Starting in no particular order, we have epistemology, the branch of academic philosophy that investigates problems or puzzles associated with knowledge. Now, of course, we have to begin with the most basic question, which is, what is knowledge? Now, that may seem like a silly question. After all, we all know what knowledge is, don't we? Well, we certainly act as if we know what it means to know. But when we try to define exactly what it means, things often get a little tricky. There's lots of cases of people who claim to know something and then turn out to be wrong. That makes clear that while they believed something, they didn't actually know it. So belief and knowledge aren't the same thing. And yet, they're necessarily related because we can't know something without also believing it. If I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I certainly also have to believe it. Thus, we discover that belief is a necessary condition for knowing, but it isn't a sufficient condition for knowing. We're going to have to add some other criteria to round out a complete and robust definition of knowledge. Now, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, we've been able to do that. We could then move on to our second problem in epistemology, which is it even possible to achieve knowledge? After all, it's one thing to know what knowledge means or know what it would mean to have knowledge, and it's quite another thing to actually possess knowledge. This is where the problem of skepticism enters the stage. Given the many limitations on ordinary cognizers like you and me, is it even possible for us to ever actually achieve a state of knowledge? But let's suppose we can find some way around the skeptic. We then face an even bigger puzzle. How do we actually achieve knowledge? And when we dive into this question, we find that there is not a single answer. Going all the way back to Plato and his most famous student Aristotle, we discover 2 very distinct approaches to arriving at knowledge, and those 2 traditions have struggled to solve this problem from the classical period right down to the Enlightenment. Even today, there are very smart people still struggling to give a satisfactory answer to this question. So epistemology is the subdiscipline of academic philosophy that struggles to answer questions relating to knowledge. Metaphysics is another area of investigation or subdiscipline of philosophy. Now, unlike epistemology, metaphysics is not focused on a single problem, but rather deals with a host of distinct issues, all relating to the nature of reality. You have, of course, learned that things are not always as they seem, and it's that realization that lies at the heart of metaphysics. After all, if things aren't as they seem, then how are they? What is the nature of reality? Now, we must keep in mind that there's a difference between what is the case and what we can know about what is the case. The first is a metaphysical problem. The second is a problem of epistemology. So if we set aside epistemological problems and focus instead solely on the question, what is the case, then we're doing metaphysics. Now, there are dozens of interesting problems in the field of metaphysics, but for our present purposes, let me just introduce you to three really big ones. Ontology is a sub-branch of metaphysics that focuses explicitly on the nature of existence, or being, or isness. We say things like, this exists, or that doesn't exist, and so on. But rarely do we stop and ask, what does it mean for something to exist? What is the nature of existence or being or isness itself? Well, ontology aims to provide an analysis of the nature of being or existence. Now, another area, another topic, another broad set of problems within metaphysics is the philosophy of mind, and it deals with consciousness. Now, consciousness is a phenomenon that each of us is intimately familiar with, as each of us is always conscious, at least of our own consciousness. But what exactly is consciousness? Is it a thing in itself that exists in the universe, or is it an emergent aspect of some other, more basic substance? Is it properly basic, or is it merely a byproduct of a properly basic substance? The answer we give to these questions has profound implications for many other important philosophical questions, like what happens to consciousness when our bodies die? So philosophy of mind is the branch of metaphysics that tries to answer these and other questions relating to the nature of consciousness. As a quick side note, psychology as an academic discipline emerged out of the philosophy of mind only around the beginning of the 20th century, so philosophy and psychology are very closely related. Quickly, one other major branch of metaphysics is the philosophy of religion. It's poorly named since religion is not at all a topic of investigation here. It would be more accurate to call this the philosophy of God, since it focuses on giving a philosophical analysis of the nature of divinity. What would it mean for something to be divine? What would it mean to properly label something God? What are the necessary properties of divinity? Does any existing thing actually have those properties? And if so, what is its relationship to the rest of the universe? These are the kinds of questions that make up this sub-branch of metaphysics. Among the myriad kinds of cognitions that occur in human consciousness, evaluative judgments are one of our favorites. But what exactly does it mean to say that one thing is better than another? What gives judgments their meaning? This is the focus of axiology, the philosophical investigation of value. Ethics is the sub-branch of axiology that investigates moral judgments, that is, judgments about that which is good and bad, and therefore which actions are right or wrong. Aesthetics analyzes the concept of beauty and includes fields like the philosophy of literature, philosophy of architecture, philosophy of music, philosophy of art, and others. Also, there's political philosophy or political theory, which focuses on the nature of justice. What is a just person? What is a just society? Why is one form of social organization better than another? If these are the kinds of questions that interest you, axiology is a branch of philosophy that you're going to want to check out. The fourth subdivision of philosophy is the subject matter for this class. Logic is the systematic investigation of reason and argument. Reason is a set of rules that govern the relationships between ideas, and when we express rational thought in language with the intention of persuasion, we have an argument. Of course, we're not always successful when we attempt to express reason in the form of an argument, so it's going to be very important for us to first figure out exactly what an argument is. What necessary conditions must be met, and what sufficient conditions will guarantee that we are engaged in argument. As we will discover over the course of our investigation, there are two very different forms of argumentation, or two different systems of logic, Induction, or informal logic, is a method of argument that allows us to derive conclusions that will follow with a degree of probability. On the other hand, deduction, or formal logic, is a system that allows us to derive conclusions necessarily. Now, while all branches of the academy use some form of logic, some application of logic, most never explicitly study the structure of reason itself, nor do they investigate how or why the methods that they use actually work. But in philosophy, logic is not only the methodology which we use to struggle with the problems of metaphysics or epistemology or axiology, it's also a subject of investigation itself. In fact, philosophy is the only academic field that makes its methodology a distinct subject of inquiry within the field. The final main subdivision of academic philosophy is the study of those who have been engaged in the philosophical enterprise itself, as well as the ideas which have emerged from that study and how they have shaped us over time. All human beings are, in part, a product of their social and historical context, and philosophers are no exception. Therefore, in order to fully understand why different philosophers have been interested in different questions over time, it helps to understand the context in which they lived. For example, to fully understand why Socrates so desperately sought knowledge of virtue, or human excellence, as it's more properly translated, we have to understand what it was like to be someone living in 5th century BCE Athens. Now, that doesn't mean that we might not also be interested in the same kind of question today, but to understand Socrates' pursuit of that question, we have to understand the world in which he lived and how that shaped his understanding of what the problem was, as well as what kinds of answers would be acceptable. The history of philosophy is the attempt to understand both the philosophers and their ideas in the social and historical context in which they occurred. It's far more than just telling the story of philosophy. It's an attempt to analyze and understand how that process has developed and indeed why. That, in turn, helps us to recognize our own contextual limitations. And by recognizing those barriers, hopefully, we will be able to avoid making unjustified assumptions in the process of our own pursuit of wisdom. So the history of philosophy is very important to study. So, academic philosophy, like academic science, is not a single discipline, but rather it's an umbrella discipline that encompasses 5 distinct but related investigations. These subdisciplines themselves divide further into other subdisciplines, which then divide into subdisciplines, which then divide into subdisciplines, which make it impossible for anyone to be an expert in all of the areas of philosophy, just as it's impossible for someone to be an expert in all of the scientific disciplines. But it is appropriate for us to have a general grasp of what the proper domains of philosophy are, just as it's essential for us to have an understanding of the scientific disciplines and their respective areas of investigation. In this short video, we've looked in an absurdly brief way at what philosophy is all about. Beyond its original meaning in ancient Greece, we can say that for us, philosophy is an academic discipline. It's a formal approach to a set of questions that we've been trying to answer for at least 2,500 years. We compared philosophy to science in this academic context, meaning that it's actually a broad set of formalized investigations that make up part of the modern academy. In that formal discipline, we discovered that there are 5 major sub-disciplines: metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, logic, and the history of philosophy, and each of those sub-disciplines has its own area of focus. But each of those subdisciplines is related to the others, not only because they sometimes overlap in their content, but also because they use the same methodology, logic, which is going to be the focus of our ongoing investigation. And why do we do philosophy at all? Why do we bother? Because we have a deep interest in understanding the truth. We want to understand not just how the world is, but also why the world is the way it is. And this is one of the most important distinctions between philosophy and other academic disciplines. Philosophy is not merely descriptive, it is also analytically normative. It isn't enough to understand that there are rules or laws that govern the universe. We also want to understand what the nature of a rule or a law is. What are those structures that underlie the laws that underlie the universe? More simply put, why is there order instead of chaos? As we will begin to see in this introduction to logic, reason is more than just a reflection of how we as human beings think. It's actually part of the nature of the universe itself, and perhaps even an essential part of any universe at all. In our next video, we are going to give a very, very brief overview of logic as a subdiscipline of philosophy. And that is going to help us to focus for the rest of this series of videos where we explore a little bit of logic.